All right, so welcome to the Investfriend presentation. Today we'll be hosting it. I'm Nick, co-founder of Hypofriend, Pension Friend, and Investfriend, a number of companies we have in the German fintech space. Today we'll be talking about buy-to-let investments. So what that means is, becoming a landlord or buying real estate to let it out. There are different words in English. In German, it's Kapitalanlage. And the focus for today is why it makes so much sense in Germany, what the benefits are, what the drawbacks or challenges are, and what our investment focus is, and what Investfriend is all about, and how it could potentially help you. So when we start at the very top level, we look at what actually makes a good investment, and we break it down into three parts. The first is potential for appreciation. The second is rental yield. And the third is, does it have tax benefits? So by appreciation, what we mean is, does the property have potential to increase in value? With rental yield, we mean, what is the ratio between the price and the rent? So for example, if you're earning 2,000 euros a year on a 200,000 euro property, that's a rental yield of 1%. Jan, if you could mute yourself real quick, that'd be great. Thanks. And then the third is tax benefits. This is one of the more interesting, but also lesser known parts of rental properties in Germany, and we'll be diving into that in the presentation today. So let's start high level with what are the major benefits of being a landlord in Germany as opposed to other countries. I'm Dutch, but grew up in the US, and we have different laws which makes being a landlord different. And what makes it so interesting in Germany in particular is that when you buy a property and you rent it out, you do not have to pay capital gains if you hold it for at least 10 years. That makes it very interesting to accumulate wealth. And that's something that's not as typical in other countries. The second is, you can write off depreciation and interest from your taxes. So if you have a mortgage and you're borrowing money to buy the investment property, you can actually write off the interest as a cost or as an expense from your rental income, so you can decrease the amount of tax you pay, so your actual income is higher. And that's quite interesting from the interest perspective, but it's also especially interesting from the depreciation perspective. Now, what depreciation is, we'll go into a little bit later, but just hold that as one of the two main benefits. The third is access to cheap KfW funding. KfW is a governmental bank in Germany which subsidizes home ownership, and they offer quite attractive terms when it comes to both first-time buyers and also investors. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The fourth is, I would say, a rather stable tenancy. So the average term is 8 years in Germany. What that means is you're not going to have to find a tenant every year or every 2 years, which makes it a rather stable and predictable source of income. Now, as you know, especially if you're living in Berlin, there are also challenges to being a landlord. The first is that there is a rental cap. This is a law which requires you, or let's say caps the amount of rent you can increase per year. So the law states that for existing leases, you're capped at 15 to 20% for every 3 years. And whether it's 15 or 20% depends on which region you're living in. So for example, Berlin is 15% and other regions are up to 20%. Either way, this kind of caps the max amount that you can increase it by. I still think this is a very, good limit. So if on average you're doing 5% every 3 years, then you're within the Grenze, so within the limit, so to say. The second is the Mietpreisbremse, which is the rent brake in Berlin, particularly for new leases. So when a property comes onto the market for the first time, it cannot be more than 10% above the so-called rental index, so the Mietspiegel. And especially for older properties, the rental index is typically rather low. So you can look between 10 and 12 euros per square meter for an existing property. Now, what's important to know is that for the Mietpreisbremse, there are exceptions. For example, new builds after 2014, as well as properties that are so-called temporarily rented out. And when it's temporarily rented out, you can also add a so-called budget for the furniture. And so you have kind of like a separate lease for the furniture, which can then come on top. And that's one loophole, which is currently being used a lot in Berlin, where if you look on ImmoScout, you wonder, hey, why are these properties, these existing properties being rented out for 25, 30 euros per square meter when all they have is a bed and a table? That's a loophole that's being used right now because of the Mietspiegel being kind of indexed so low. So landlords are trying to find ways to go above that. And that's one of the loopholes, which, to be honest, I think is going to be closed in the next 2 years. I'm not 100% confident about it, but if you read the news and you see the local elections and the SPD, who are trying to close this loophole, there is a chance that if there are a lot of landlords who are using this loophole, that they will have to either regulate the furniture expense. So instead of charging an additional 800 euros per month, they'll be capped on that furniture. Or, for example, just that the temporary rental leases are no longer allowed. The third is, in the case that you do rent it out, you do have to make sure that you understand the regulatory framework. So, for example, when it comes to tenants, they have very strong protection. And that's something that you as a landlord have to take into account. And it requires very good reason to evict or cancel a tenant. So, for example, if a tenant does not pay the rent for 2 months consecutively, that is a reason to cancel the contract. Additionally, there is a way to claim the apartment back for own use, or Eigenbedarf, which would imply that, for example, in the rental contract you state after 3 years I need the property back. Why? Because my family, either you yourself or a family member, intends on using the apartment. So this is common, for example, for parents buying an apartment for their children. This is a common way of ensuring that they get the apartment back. Now, it is also misused by landlords who, for example, are just saying they need Eigenbedarf and then they cancel the tenant and then they re-rent it out. You have to be very careful with this, because if you get caught with this, obviously this would make you liable. Now, the fourth is the recent energy efficiency requirements. So if you're buying an existing property that's run down, you have to make sure that you're looking at the energy efficiency, as there are requirements for modernization that are coming up. By 2030, you have to have it modernized to the energy class F and E by 2033. So all in all, you have some pretty strong benefits on the financial side, and on the challenges, I would say it's rather a framework that you have to work with. And it's also a way to kind of guide you into what kind of investments make sense and what kind of investments don't make sense. And using this framework, we've actually figured out for ourselves what we think are low risk, high opportunity kind of investments. So I saw there was one question about depreciation. I didn't quite see what it was. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what depreciation is, it's a concept. I mean, maybe you know it from accounting, or let's take an example like a a car. So as soon as you drive a car out of the parking lot, it loses value by about 20%. Now, because in the past, companies had to account for their inventory, they would come up with this concept of depreciation, which is the idea where the value decreases over time. And now, just like a car decreases in value or an Apple laptop decreases in value, the same theory can be applied to real estate. Even if it's a little bit counterintuitive that the value increases on the public market, but in theory, from an accounting perspective, it depreciates. And that depreciation, so let's say a property with a depreciation of 2%, what that entails is that in 50 years, its value will be considered zero. And they've used this accounting technique to basically create a tax advantage for people who are renting out their property. Now, originally, this was in the last 20 years, since about 2000, it was fixed at around 2 to 3% for buildings built between 1925 and 2023. Now, in 2024, what is so interesting is that they've introduced several new depreciation laws. And what they are as follows. So the first is every property built after October 2023, and this law will be until 2029, they can now, instead of doing the 2 or 2.5% depreciation, they now do 3% linear or 5% degressive. And the difference between linear and degressive is that in linear, the base always stays the same. So if you buy it for 300K and you're depreciating 3%, it's every time 3% of the 300K. Whereas if it's the degressive and you take 5%, in year 2, it's 295 as opposed to 300. And so obviously at a certain point, the linear depreciation makes more sense. And the beauty is that you can switch between the two. Now, what's even more interesting is that in 2024, they came up with a new law called Sonderafa, which is nothing other than special depreciation, which is an extra depreciation. So on the one hand, you have the 5% for anything built after 2023. On the one hand, it's the 5%, but then you also have the 5% linear. And so you have 5 and 5, and you basically have 10% depreciation. Now, the requirement for the special depreciation is that it's only on new built properties with a high energy efficiency class, so EH40 it's called, with the quality seal QNG+. And what's important is that it only properties that are built under 5,200 euros per square meter construction price. And that's quite critical because what you see is that the government is doing nothing more than trying to subsidize buildings, but low-cost, affordable housing, which is obviously not going to be inside of Berlin, but is outside of Berlin where the land value and the building costs are lower. So the closer you are to Berlin, the higher the land value, and then the higher the cost is that they end up building and selling for. So that's quite important. And then the third so-called special depreciation, which has actually been around for quite a while, since 1986 already, but hasn't been used so much, is the Denkmal depreciation. So Denkmal is a monument building protection. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially a very old building that has special features or characteristics that they want to protect. And why that is quite interesting now is because you have, on the one hand, the linear depreciation of 9% and then the 7% for 4 years. So you have a 100% depreciation within 12 years. Why it's so interesting is because now you have combinations of Denkmal depreciation combined with KfW financing. And we're going to get into that in a little bit, but this has changed the whole buying new build versus buying existing build equation. And we'll go into that with a little example. So when you take a regular building that was built after 1925 and pre-2022, you had have a depreciation of 2%. So what's really important is that depreciation is a tax benefit, and of course the tax benefit is going to be higher for people with a higher income. Why? Because they are in a higher tax bracket and therefore pay more tax. Now, if we take an example of a building that's or a purchase price of 300K with a land value of 50K, we then have a purchase value of 250K. Now, what's important is that you can only depreciate the building value and not the land value, right? Because land, I mean, logically, you can't depreciate land, but you can say, hey, the building materials, the floors, everything, it depreciates. So you depreciate the building value only. So in this case, if you take the classic 2% of 250K, you are left with a depreciation annual budget of 5K. Now, if you were to deduct that from your taxes with a 47% marginal tax rate, not average tax rate, but marginal tax rate, you would get 2,350 euros, which if you're renting out is nice, especially if, for example, you have a lower interest rate. It can help you get to a positive cash flow, but we'll get into the exact calculations later. Now, if you look at a depreciation example with the new Sonder AFA, where you have, let's say, a QNG plus energy efficiency 40 home, so one of the very new energy efficient properties, you take the same taxable income, you take the same building and land value, you actually have now a depreciation of 25K. So 10% of 250 is 25. Again, you take the 4,700. In this case, you have tax savings of 11,750. So you see that just in 1 year, depending on what you buy, the same price and everything, you actually now have a difference in 9,400 euros, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a huge difference, and that's basically just because you're buying a different asset or a different type of property. And that's something that's quite interesting. But that's not the only thing that's interesting, because in 2024, Germany also introduced attractive financing options for landlords buying energy efficient KfW 40 or Denkmal KfW 40 properties. So in this case, we have the program 298 and the program 261. In both cases, the government basically works, or let's say KfW works together with the main lender. So in this case, it could be Berliner Sparkasse, Deutsche Bank, MBS, whoever. And they basically, if the property is, let's say 250K, they fund 150K of that 250K. So that means you get 150K from KfW and you only get 100K from Sparkasse. Now, what's interesting is that the interest rate is a little bit lower than the main interest rate. And it also sometimes decreases the overall interest rate because it can partially be counted as equity, partially. But depending on the bank and how they use it, we have to look into what we call our offer search, and it calculates it automatically. But that's only one part. So a lower interest rate is great, but what's especially interesting is that in KfW 298, you actually have a repayment-free period of up to 5 years. So in that case, as some of you, if you've had a mortgage consultation with us before, you know that you have a monthly rate, which is based on your interest rate and your repayment or tilgung. And of course, your monthly rate goes up if either one of these is higher. If the repayment is higher, you repay it quicker. If the interest rate is higher, you repay it slower. Or that's actually not true, but you have a higher monthly rate. So in this case, what's so interesting is that when you have a principal-free period, or let's say tilgungsfrei period of 5 years, your monthly rate is much lower, and that can actually make your cash flow positive at the beginning, better at the beginning, and it increases your so-called rate of return. So in a perfect world, as an investor, you invest as little as possible, you leverage as much as possible, and you repay as little as possible in a leveraged product which can increase in value over time, which is generating cash for you, and then at the end you repay it all or you sell it all. Now, the second program is for these Denkmal properties. So in this case, when you take an old building, you renovate it completely, you actually have more or less the same 150K, but what's even more interesting is that the interest rate is A, lower, and B, you get a repayment budget of 30K. So they're literally giving you money to modernize this kind of project. So this Denkmal, this monument kind of project. So the whole idea here behind this program and the law changes is to incentivize the project developers to build, but also investors to invest in these projects. And that's also why we created Investfriend. So we saw an opportunity to leverage our experience with over 10,000 mortgages and a huge banking network, because we come from the finance side and because we come from the, let's say, the objective side. We look at the numbers first, and we're not really selling. So what we do is we have a very strict due diligence. We're looking at project developers who are selling these projects commission free. And what we do is we take over the marketing and the sales of the project. What we do is we evaluate the projects based on their tax benefits and whether it can then lead to interesting depreciation allowances for certain customers. What we focus on in our due diligence is in the different, like which projects are interesting given which cities, and if they're close to, for example, the cities where we think in the next 10, 15 years we can still expect higher than average growth. And lastly, Investfriend, from a, let's say, service part, we take over the, let's say, the tenant search. We take over a lot of the kind of the hassle that you would expect that you would have with a tenant. We work together with a property management agency, and we try to streamline the tax declaration. So we're trying to build this all-in-one service. We're still very much in the early phases because this is only 6 months old, and the law for special depreciation came in March 2024. So we jumped on this, and we've now been basically the last 6 months, 9 months, going across the country trying to find the best projects for you guys. So what do we vet, and how do we vet it? Well, let's just go through our thought process. Well, we look at which projects are eligible for a special kind of depreciation. We then look at it from the bank's perspective and the consumer's perspective. Is the price fair? And whether the price is fair is also dependent on a lot of other factors. I will show you a little bit like one of the things that we look at with the valuation example. On the one hand, I think we have 4 or 5 different valuation tools, depending on which bank we use, ING, DKB, Sparkasse, whatever. There's a different valuation mechanism in the back, which is important because it tells you, the client or the customer, what percentage can be financed. Some banks can finance up to 110% of that value, others cannot. Typically, with new build projects, we're looking at financing between 90 and 95%, typically because banks are a little bit more conservative than what you would expect. So the market price and the lending value, so to say, have a disparity of sometimes 5-10%. This is important because as an investor, the more equity you have to put in, the lower your overall internal rate of return or your return on equity after 10, 15, or 20 years. Then we have the rentability outlook. So how is this, in this case, it's Telto. How is Telto going to develop in the next 5, 10 years? That has a lot to do with population growth and accessibility. Why? Because if it's very accessible, it typically has higher demand. We see that, for example, in other cities, but for example, take Berlin, for example, whenever you have a outskirt which has a new train station or a new tram station, better accessibility, you see that you have higher growth, especially when you look at Brandenburg, Teltow, Zossen, a number of these places, they benefit from better transport. Then the last is we look at building quality. So what are the actual materials? How is it being built? What kind of quality standard is it? How is a building being built? With which companies? Are the sun panels on top of the roof? Is it every little detail? So, and then the last is looking at the developer track record. So looking at developers who have at least 5 years or 10 different projects on their track record that they've successfully delivered. And we can go back to the evaluation example in a bit, but I'll explain a little bit our investment focus. So when you look at our presentation, you see kind of leads you to our investment focus. We're now focused only on new build. Why? Because this avoids the rental caps, as simple as that. It has a higher resale value. So data is now coming out, which shows the property valuation trends across different energy efficiency classes, and you're starting to see that the resale value is correlating a lot more with energy efficiency. So one of our hypotheses is that in 10, 15 years, you will have to have a much higher energy efficiency class. And lastly, C is lower maintenance. So typically we calculate with, for existing builds, like in Berlin, we have a budget of about 1% per year. With these new builds, it's much lower, which is very important for your cash flow and as an investor. The second is energy efficiency. So why? Well, two main points is, as mentioned above, KfW subsidies. So the lower interest rates, but also the preferred repayment options, and then even in some case the Tilgungszuschuss, so the 30K for the Denkmal, and then you have, of course, the 10% tax depreciation that you can write off. Then the third is within 1.5 hours of A+ cities. So we have a number of cities, also Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, so cities that have higher growth than the rest of Germany, positive population growth. And then the fourth is, as I said, projects or developers with 5+ or 10+, sorry, I misspoke, 5 years and 10 projects, small typo, to minimize the risk of delays. So now I'll hand it over to Jan. He's going to talk a little bit about one of the projects, why it's not really so much about this project in particular, but it's about showing you our thinking for it. And then we'll dive straight into a calculation model and show you guys how it all works.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for explaining the basics and the great overview. As discussed, I will show you one of our projects. I also read in the chat that you are interested in Denkmalschutz, new build projects and other stuff. We have also a lot of projects coming up in the next weeks and months, and therefore I will just show you this as one of the examples. This one is located in Zossen. I will also explain briefly a little bit about the location on the following slides. It has in total 92 units. There are 4 units per house, so it's actually an atypical building style for an investment project because it's built in double houses, as you can see. All those houses reach the highest energy efficiency, which requires, for instance, solar panels, heating pumps. So they have really top-notch technology in order to reach those standards. and therefore it's usually quite challenging to find those purchase prices. So you are still have a functional financing or good cash flow on this project, and B, you're still following the regulations on the depreciation allowances. I will explain some of the requirements later on, but just for now, there's a cap of 5,200 euro per square meter, and we make sure that our projects are keeping this. This cap is actually on the building cost. Here in our project with, for instance, the 53 square meter apartment and the 250K cost, we are definitely keeping this. So our cost is around 4,500 euro per square meter. Why we think this project is really interesting is that it comes also with a garden and a parking spot. So you're a little bit outside of the city, but you still have some benefits out of this. You got a very high energetic property and a garden space, which you will most likely not find in the city. I would now take over the screen sharing, Nick, and will quickly show a calculation of our calculator. So we actually built a calculator especially for our projects here. I will zoom in a little bit more to give you some better view. This is an example of one of our projects, which is in Zossen. I will zoom even a little bit more. I think that should be better. So just to give you a quick overview, here we can see the building, we can see the sizes, the expected rent which we have here. With most of our developers, we are actually even working with a guaranteed rent, which means you have a target price which they reach, and if they don't reach it, it's guaranteed. So you get this rent for the first full year. Combined with the parking space, we can look at a expected rent per month of 765, which gives us a rental return per year of 3.67 in comparison to this purchase price of 250K. Those two fields actually mean that we are meeting all the requirements in order to be able to depreciate with two of the tax benefits. I will explain this a little bit detailed later. This is an amount of purchase fees we are covering with here, and on top of the purchase fees, we are covering also an equity amount of 5%, because it's quite tricky usually to get 100% financing on those Neubau projects. Usually we calculate with 95% to be sure that the financing will work out. So we require an equity amount, in this case, of 35K. What's interesting here is now the blended interest rate, which you can see here, the 3.06%. I also saw the question in the chat before, where you were wondering if you can still cover this basically with the current interest rates. Quick excursus to our financing page, where we actually show you how we calculate. So we have a KfW loan, which is up to 150K, which is a way better interest rate than a normal bank loan right now. 2.69 fixed for 10 years, and the amount is 150K, which you can use here. The rest of the mortgage would be financed with a normal bank loan, for instance, Deutsche Bank, Sparkasse, or whatever bank you want to use for your financing. And in our calculation here, we then blend this rate together and get a rate of 3.06% for 10 years. Based on this rate and a repayment rate that we can use for this investment properties of 1.5%, we will have a monthly mortgage rate of 714. So when we look up in the rent that you receive here, we are slightly cash flow positive. However, we are also considering that you are covering cost for the Hausgeld and the property management. Usually when you're an investor, you want to have a Sondereigentumsverwaltung in German, which is basically taking care about communication with the tenants, which is taking care of the Nebenkostenabrechnung and all the other documentation stuff. So that's also calculated in here. And we're also calculating with an amount of savings that you build with the house community. This part here is actually the explanation of the text that Nick did before. I will not get into detail, but I will quickly show you how we calculate this. So we working with an income of 120K, and we are also considering that there's 1 year building time of the project. So 1 year from today, we are expecting that the project is finished. So in the very first year, we can actually partly depreciate the project. You see here, that's the rest of the year that we can still use. And in this column, we basically see the whole depreciation over the following years. This column next here explains the special depreciation, which we can use, where we get additional 5% in the first 4 years. What we then do is actually to combine this and calculating this against your tax bracket to understand what is really your tax savings that you get out of here. So those column then describes the tax savings that you actually get whenever you are filing your taxes in the following years. So basically in the year after the completion, you get this amount, following year that, and then this amount. In the first 4 years, therefore, you're basically already receiving 35 or almost 36,000 back from your tax bracket, which is covering actually all of your initial down payment. So that's something that we really like to look into. Is this covering the down payment with your tax bracket? Does it make sense on this behalf? And then further on, we are looking a little bit further in the depreciation potential. So we are expecting, in that case, just as an example, in Zossen, which is a little bit further outside of the city, an appreciation of 3%. We're also just working with a, let's say, quite conservative number of 2% in rental increase, which is just the inflation, as you know. And based on these numbers, we are calculating the profitability and also the percentage of your invested capital. The calculation here is based on the appreciation, on your tax benefits, and also on the operational cost that you're basically having with the property, where we include the house geld, the savings, the difference between the rent and the mortgage payment. And we also include here your initial cost of the purchase fees. And therefore, we're calculating the whole profit, which is in this case 122K over a time frame of 10 years. If you want to compare to other investments, we show you this number here, the IRR, which can be used to compare it, for instance, for ETFs or other investment instruments. Just as a comparison, ETF roughly would have a 6 to 7% IRR when you really look into the best performing ones over 10 years. As mentioned, there are some requirements in order to make this depreciation possible. So Nick already mentioned a couple of those in the beginning, but just to recap, we have the EH40QNG standard that we need. We also have the requirement that the buildings need to be super new. It's actually quite a tough regulation because the building permit cannot be older than October 2023, which means in the turnaround that you actually need a builder that can build this property quite fast. So that's also something we look into, that our builders don't have building times that are lasting too long, but we're looking into building times of 1 year to maximum 2 years roughly. The building cost is 5,200 euro, as described before. Here we also exclude the plot price. I think this was also one of the questions from the chat earlier. The last 3 requirements are that the apartment must be rented out, that your income must be taxed in Germany. So if your plan is, for instance, that you move away from Germany in the next couple of years, then it might not be the best decision to invest here. But if your time frame of investment is, let's say, 4 to 6 years, then it surely makes sense, because in that case, you still make use of this double depreciation, where you would have the most benefit from the tax savings, and it would definitely still make sense again. Also, one recommendation is to only start with the income that's higher than 60K on a per annum, because there the tax benefits will start to get interesting, basically. On this slide, I would just like to give you some context on the location where we were speaking about. So this cap of 5,200 euro makes it quite tough to invest in properties in big cities like Berlin, because the purchase prices, especially for the standard of energy efficiency, are usually way higher, like 8 or 10K per square meter. When we go a little bit further outside, we still reach prices where this is actually possible. What we then look into very closely is trends in this region, why this region is still attractive. So in our eyes, Zossen is surely not Berlin, but it's also not too far away. It's just 20 kilometers outside of the city. And what's very important to us is that we actually have a direct train connection to the city. So Zossen provides a train station which brings you to the airport in 20 minutes and actually to the city in 45 minutes. And they will even improve this train connection. So they are currently working on this, and by summer 2025, it will be completed. And there will be shorter travel times to Berlin, and there will also be a higher frequency of trains traveling between Zossen and the city. Furthermore, we are also looking into economic trends in this region. So all in all, this Landkreis is actually growing as one of the fastest Landkreise in all of Germany. A couple of trends which we see here is, for instance, surely everybody knows that the airport opened a couple of years ago. However, what we currently see is that Google is building data centers next to Zossen in Mittenwalde. They are investing 1 billion in a project for data centers here. And what we also saw as news recently was that Amazon Web Services announced that they want to invest around 7 billion. So those are clear trends that we see, which will in the future increase land prices in those regions. And therefore, we think as a long-term investment, that could definitely be super interesting for our clients. This is basically the calculation that we went into. I'm showing this again to quickly show you some of the examples and also show you some of the assumptions that we worked in this case, because our goal is here to show you a clear comparison also to other projects. And on the following slides, I will show you an example of an existing property and how the performance is there. For instance, also without the building time, which is set here as 1 year, and the other parameters are more or less the same. In this case, we worked with 120K gross income, 95% financing, and we can work with a KfW mortgage. Therefore, we get a way better blended interest rate. The down payment in that case would be 35K, and an expected completion date would be Q4 next year. The outcome here is that we roughly have 22% in IRR in the first 10 years. On top, we receive tax savings of 55K in those years. And the overall outcome or the overall gain, net financial gain, whenever I sell the property, capital gains tax-free in the next 10 years or after the next 10 years, is 122K. As a comparison, we are now looking into an existing property in Berlin. The price here is 250K for a 50 square meter apartment. Therefore, we're ending up with a price of around 5,000 euro. This property is not renovated, therefore probably has a higher Hausgeld or Wohngeld, and we're looking into a low energy efficiency, which for the tenant means usually a higher warm rent than for a new build property. Therefore, this property is not eligible for any degressive depreciation of 5%, or also not eligible for the special depreciation, but only for this 2% depreciation. Also, we don't. This doesn't provide any parking spots or garden spaces here, and we need to be sure that also here the Berlin rent regulations apply, and we cannot increase the rent according to market prices or according to fast increases here. We work with the same assumptions of the persona, but in this case, we even showed you how it looked like with 100% financing. So you would only bring in 21K in this financing, but still the overall outcome, because of this way lower depreciation and no KfW funding, is way worse. So you saw before we had a 21, almost 22% appreciation. Now we're working with a 14.6%. The tax savings, as seen here, are way lower with 31K in the first 10 years, and therefore also the overall result is way lower. So you have a overall gain of 90K in the first 10 years whenever you sell the property afterwards. As one of the last things today, we would just like you to show you the steps, or the 4 key steps as we define them in order to become a landlord. I think it's super important that you understand your own financial goals, also the time frame of investment. We usually recommend of having a time frame of 10 years as an overall investment, because afterwards you can sell the capital gains tax-free, and you don't pay extra cost on the property. Also, usually we will fix the mortgages for 10 years, which is quite standard in Germany. And therefore, you should ask yourself if you have this time frame available, and also ask yourself if you would stay in Germany for the next 4 to 6 years in order to benefit from all the tax savings. In case you plan on leaving way earlier, then it may not make super sense to invest here. But if it's 4 to 6 years, I would still recommend it, and keep the property still for the next 10 years and sell it afterwards, so you still make the best gain from it. As a second point, you should consider your investment goals. You should set an amount that you would be able to invest also for this time frame you're seeking for. And you should consider what is your long-term approach. So what appreciation potential are you considering, and how you can actually achieve this. The next step would be to speak with a financial expert. As Hypofriend, which is our parent company, we would love to help you with this. Probably some of you have been already in touch with us. So what we do as a first step usually is to check the affordability for our clients, so you can really understand what budget do you have, and then we underlie this with real offers of the banks, and can show you what kind of cash flow you have, and we show you the optimal down payment in order to maybe even improve your interest rate here. And the last point would still be to find the matching property. So we highly recommend to look into locations that are interesting, look into trends there, look into apartment sizes that you can afford, also look into building quality, consider what you may need to invest down the road if it's not a new build property. So that's a maintenance cost that you probably need to plan in. So if you're a first-time investor, it probably will make sense to also look for new build properties that are not so heavy in personal effort, since if you want just to have it as a passive investment, from our view, it makes the most sense to look into this like our approach, basically. As a next step or last step, before we answer more questions, I would just like to invite you to learn more about our upcoming projects. So you can either join or look into our homepage on investfriend.de. We also have a calculator. It's a smaller version of that, what I just showed you. This version we will calculate with you in the calls. So if you're interested in this, you can, and you actually have your smartphone ready, you can also just check the QR code and actually book an appointment right away from the slide. if you have any other questions, you can basically just ask us in the chat, and then we can also answer them now publicly.
So there are a couple questions. So from Manek, if you move out and rent it out for higher than interest, do you have to pay tax on the rental income? So the way it works is you always pay tax on any income. You pay your tax rate on your total income, your personal tax rate on your total income. So you're basically adding everything together. But the point is with depreciation, you take the interest and the depreciation away from the taxable income. So you can make it look like the property is losing money. That's the whole concept of it, right? So when in reality, you're getting the cash back from the government. Jack, what will happen for second onwards year of rental if I lived 800K away? Well, you should have a tenant who pays your rent for whatever that amount is. So the guarantee is for the first year, and then from the second year on, it's your responsibility as the landlord. But of course, here we have the property manager who can help with the tenant search. But we don't expect to have turnover after the first year. So the goal is to find a tenant within the first 2 or 3 months. It's in everyone's interest. For the tax declaration, it's basically it's like Anlage 4, it's like a special part of the tax declaration, which has a couple of inputs, and we have a tax advisor that we're working with to streamline the tax declaration. It will cost about 250 euros per year per unit to file the tax return, and they're very competent. Okay, any other questions? If you guys want, you can maybe Jan, you can go to Investfriend landing page and then scroll down to the calculator.
Sure.
Thanks for the chat. Any advice on manage a property from abroad? Do you mean managing an Investfriend or like an investment property from outside of Germany? One that you already have? In general, my house I own in Germany. Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but in general, you can work with a property management firm that manages all interactions with the tenants. For example, I have properties that I've never talked to the tenants before. I have never had to deal with anything, and it's very hands off. So I think that's one common misconception, is that it's a lot of work. In terms of taxes, it depends on the specific country you're living and how they treat the property. That's so the main point is if you earn rental income in Germany, you will have to pay tax in Germany. That's one, but I don't know where you are and what the tax, if there's a tax treaty. So for example, the US. Why are you doing this? Are you getting kickbacks? Yeah, as I mentioned, we are getting a fee. So we get a sales commission from the developer for every unit that we sell. Standard business that Deutsche Vermögen or Swiss Life also does, except we do it for a tiny fraction of the price. Why? Because we are using technology, lower marketing costs. We don't employ hundreds of brokers. So yeah, we get a fee, and it depends per project. And it's built into the purchase price. So we have to keep the price as low as possible. Osama as Telto, yeah, so here some of the key point is that it's does not include the land value. So typically what you want to keep in mind is we have 20-80%. So 20% land value, 80% building. So that's the number that we calculate with. So that's part of the due diligence that we do for the different projects. So what you can imagine right now is that there are lots of KfW 55 projects still on the market, and these are harder for developers to sell, and they're trying to transition to the newer energy class. And so it's a bit of a first come, first serve. And with the way it works, it takes about 4 years to start a building project. So it requires acquiring the land, getting the permits and everything. And this takes a long time. So it's not something you can just spin up. And that's something we're observing right now. And we're trying to vet the different projects that are coming onto the market. What is consulting fee from Hypofriend? So Hypofriend gets paid by the bank. It's a standard fee on the order of 1%, same as every other broker. But we try to keep our fee as low as possible. How do we do that? Well, we have our own mortgage search platform where we're running arbitrage on the different banks. So you can have, for example, Deutsche Bank on 3 platforms and have 3 different interest rates because of the overarching contracts that platform has with the bank. And we're the only broker in the market who has this, or does this. Most have to stick with one platform. Okay. Okay, thanks, Mike. We used Hypofriend before. They were great. I hope that's not Mike from Hypofriend. Trying to spam some pro Hypofriend stuff. Yeah, we do our best. It doesn't always go perfectly, but let's say in 9.5 out of 10 cases it goes well. Yeah, we do specialize in expats because typically you have PR, TR, so different residencies statuses, and this is something that most banks struggle to understand and most brokers don't have experience with. So part of our offer search, as I mentioned, allows us to program that in and allows us to retrieve offers for dependent on, let's say, a PR, TR, blue card holder, visa, different kind of requirements. And that helps us deliver a better service, but also kind of work with a group that is a little bit underserved. So, but is in the end very financially eligible. So I hope that covers it. Yeah, so as mentioned, these are 2 example projects on our homepage. We now have almost 5 or 6 projects. We are weighing the trade-offs between some of them, and we do have a number of people who've already reserved. I think over 75 people reserved in Ehegattenschaukel, and Telto is also, I think, almost 80% sold out or reserved. So those are moving. But yeah, let's see. If you want to learn more about the specific projects and, for example, your down payment requirements relative to the specific size of the property or the specific layout, there's a lot of kind of intricacies that we can discuss in a personal consultation, which we don't have too much time for right now. Yeah, so thank you guys for all the great questions. Thanks, Jan, for joining me, and I wish you all a super nice dark evening in Berlin, and yeah, appreciate it. And if you guys have any questions, you can also ask in Telegram, LinkedIn, or email. Yeah. I always enjoy answering your questions, so yeah, let me know. Appreciate it. And I'll probably see if we got the recording done right. I'm a little bit worried that one of us is muted, but I will double check it, and otherwise I'll send around the slides. Thank you guys so much. Have a good evening. Bye.
Good evening. Bye bye.
Bye.